The day my family laughed at my old car, they thought they were laughing at a man who had lost everything. They had no idea that behind the faded paint, scratched doors, and noisy engine was a man quietly preparing for the biggest comeback of his life. I pulled into my family's driveway on a warm Saturday afternoon, driving the same 22-year-old car I had owned for years. The paint had lost its shine, one of the doors had a small dent, and the dashboard made an irritating clicking sound whenever I made a sharp turn. It was not the kind of car people noticed in a positive way, but it was reliable enough to get me where I needed to go. I parked beside my brother Daniel's new luxury SUV, and almost immediately I could hear laughter coming from the backyard. Daniel looked toward my car and shook his head with a grin. "Mark, you're still driving this?" he asked. I smiled and stepped out. "It still runs." My sister laughed from behind him. "That's what you always say. You were a CEO once. What happened?" I could feel everyone looking at me. They weren't really asking about the car. They were asking about my life. 2 years earlier, I had been fired from Harrington Industrial after nearly 19 years with the company. I had started as a young financial analyst and eventually became its chief executive officer. When I lost that position, my family assumed I had reached the end of my career. They saw the old car, the simple clothes, and the fact that I no longer talked about business, and they created their own story. Daniel walked closer and tapped the roof of my car. "You know, Mark, if you need help, you can just ask." Everyone laughed again. I could have told them the truth right then. I could have explained that I was doing better financially than I had been during my final years as CEO. I could have told them about the consulting company I had quietly built from my home office. I could have shown them the documents sitting inside my briefcase. But I said nothing. I simply smiled, picked up the birthday gift I had brought for Daniel, and walked toward the backyard while their laughter continued behind me. 2 years earlier, I had been sitting in a conference room on the top floor of Harrington Industrial, completely unaware that my 19-year career was about to end in less than 10 minutes. I had joined the company as a young financial analyst and spent nearly 2 decades working my way through every level of the business. I knew the employees by name, understood our customers, and knew which suppliers could be trusted. By the time I became CEO, I believed I had earned the respect of the board. But everything changed when several new investors gained influence over the company. They wanted immediate profits, aggressive cost-cutting, and decisions that would make the company's numbers look better within months. I warned them that those choices would hurt the business in the long run. They wanted to reduce experienced staff, so I refused. They wanted to cancel important supplier relationships, so I pushed back. They wanted to sell one of our strongest divisions because it could bring quick money, but I believed that division was part of the company's future. Instead of listening, they began describing me as resistant to change. Then one afternoon, I received a message asking me to attend a private meeting. When I entered the conference room, 3 board members were already waiting. The chairman sat at the center of the table with a folder in front of him. Beside him was a man I had never seen before. I immediately understood that something was wrong. The chairman avoided eye contact as he explained that the board had decided to move in a different direction. I asked what that meant. He finally looked at me and said, "Your employment ends today." I sat there silently for several seconds. 19 years of work had been reduced to one sentence. I asked if they had considered the consequences of their decisions, But the chairman simply told me the company needed new leadership. I packed my belongings into a cardboard box and walked through the same hallway where employees had once congratulated me on becoming CEO. Some people looked away because they didn't know what to say. Others stared at me in disbelief. When I reached the parking lot, I placed the box inside my old car and sat behind the steering wheel. For the first time in 19 years, I had no company meeting waiting for me the next morning, no executive schedule, and no title to protect, while the people inside Harrington Industrial believed they had finally removed the obstacle standing in their way. Instead of immediately searching for another executive position, I decided to step back and observe what was happening at Harrington Industrial from the outside. I knew the company too well to believe that my dismissal had solved its problems. The board had blamed me for resisting their plans, but I had always believed the real danger was the speed at which they were changing a business that had taken decades to build. For the first few weeks, I stayed quiet. I spent my mornings working from a small office in my home, reviewing industry reports, studying market trends, and keeping track of Harrington's public financial information. Then I noticed the first warning signs. Several long-term customers began moving their contracts to competitors. A few experienced managers announced that they were leaving. Suppliers who had worked with Harrington for years started demanding stricter payment terms. The company was still reporting profits, but the numbers didn't tell the whole story. The foundation underneath those profits was becoming weaker every month. While Harrington struggled, I started building something of my own. I created a small consulting business focused on helping manufacturing companies reduce waste, improve production systems, and repair damaged supplier relationships. At first, I worked from my home office with an old laptop and a simple desk. My first client was a small manufacturer that had been losing money for almost a year. I spent several weeks studying its operations and discovered that the company was wasting thousands of dollars through inefficient purchasing and poor inventory management. After helping them fix the problem, they recommended me to another business. Then another client came. Slowly, my consulting company grew beyond anything I had expected. I was earning more than I had earned during some of my years as CEO, but I never changed my lifestyle. I continued driving the same old car and wearing simple clothes. My family assumed that meant I was struggling. They didn't know that I was deliberately keeping my expenses low while reinvesting most of my money into the business. I also continued watching Harrington Industrial. The stock price kept falling. The company's most valuable employees were leaving. Several important customers were negotiating with competitors, and rumors began circulating that the board might eventually have to sell the company. One evening, my attorney called me and asked if I had seen the latest reports. I told him I had. Then he said something that made me sit up straight. "Mark, Harrington may be available much sooner than anyone expected." When my attorney told me Harrington Industrial might be available for purchase, I didn't celebrate. I knew this wasn't just another business opportunity. This was the company where I had spent 19 years of my life, the company that had fired me, and the same company whose leadership had convinced everyone I was the reason things were going wrong. Now, after watching the business decline from the outside, I finally had a chance to do something about it. I asked my attorney to gather every piece of information he could find about the company's financial position, outstanding debts, contracts, assets, and ownership structure. The numbers were shocking, Harrington was worth only a fraction of what it had been worth when I was CEO. The board had damaged the relationships I had spent years building, and investors were losing confidence. I looked at the figures for several nights before making my decision. Then I said, "I want to buy it." My attorney stared at me for a moment. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "I've never been more certain. We created an investment company so my name would not appear directly in the early stages of the negotiations. The purpose was simple. I didn't want the board to know who was making the offer. If they discovered I was behind it, they might reject the deal simply because of the history between us. The negotiations continued for almost 3 months. Representatives from both sides exchanged documents, discussed valuations, reviewed contracts, and argued over the final price. The Harrington board believed they were negotiating with a private investment group that wanted to restructure the company. They had no idea the person behind the offer had once sat in the same building as their CEO. Eventually, the final agreement was prepared. I sat in my attorney's office as the documents were placed in front of me. I read every page carefully before signing. When I finally put my pen down, my attorney looked at me and smiled. "It's official." I leaned back in my chair and took a slow breath. After 2 years of being told I had failed, I now owned the company that had fired me. The next morning, I drove my old car toward Harrington's headquarters. I parked in the same employee parking area I had used for years and walked through the front entrance. Several employees recognized me immediately. Some smiled, others looked confused. Then the former chairman stepped into the lobby, saw me holding the ownership documents, and stopped in his tracks as I said, "Good morning." The former chairman stared at me as if he couldn't understand what he was seeing. His eyes moved from my face to the documents in my hand, and then back to my face. "Mark," he finally said. I nodded calmly. "Good morning." He looked confused. "What are you doing here?" I placed the documents on the reception desk. "I think you already know." He picked them up and began reading. Within seconds, the color drained from his face. The company he had once controlled was no longer his. I had purchased the controlling shares, and every decision about Harrington Industrial now came through me. Word spread through the building within minutes. Employees gathered quietly in hallways, whispering to each other. Some couldn't believe the former CEO had returned. Others remembered the day I had been fired and carried my belongings out in a cardboard box. I didn't call a meeting to embarrass anyone. I called it because I wanted every employee to hear directly from me what would happen next. When the conference room filled, I stood at the front and looked at hundreds of familiar faces. "I know many of you are surprised to see me here," I said. "But I didn't buy this company because I wanted revenge." The room became silent. "I bought it because I still believe in what this company can become." I explained that the first priority would be rebuilding trust. Experienced employees who had been pushed out under the previous management would be contacted. Important customer relationships would be repaired. Suppliers who had been treated unfairly would be approached again. I wanted the company to stop chasing quick profits and start building lasting value. After the meeting, one of my former colleagues approached me. He had worked at Harrington for more than 15 years, but had nearly resigned after my dismissal. He shook my hand and said, "I always knew you weren't finished." I thanked him and returned to my office. For the first time in 2 years, I sat behind the same desk where I had once worked as CEO. But this time, things were different. I wasn't there because a board had given me a title. I was there because I owned the company. A few weeks later, I returned to my family's house in the same old car they had laughed at. Daniel saw me step out and started making another joke. But then my sister walked outside holding her phone and asked, "Mark, is this really true?" She showed me an article about the new owner of Harrington Industrial, and for the first time, nobody in the driveway had anything to say.